Hello students, today we are going to do a famous science fiction novel called Brave New World, written by Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley was one of the most important science fiction writers of the 20th century. He was writing during the decades of the 20s, 30s and 40s. In the decades of the 20s, his novels represent a sense of disillusionment. In the 30s, his novels are cynical, and in the 40s, they have a sense of questioning. These were also the three moods of the age. Therefore, you find this representation in Huxley's novels, 20s, 30s, and 40s specifically. This novel, which we have today for our lesson, was written in 1932. Let me repeat the name, Brave New World. Science fiction, as most of you must know, uses the discoveries of science in an imaginative way. The reason is that thinkers feel that if we use scientific progress without control, then although we are getting progress, but that is a mindless kind of progress. What we require is scientific progress with a lot of control. So here, Huxley, who was a famous thinker also, apart from being a novelist, questions the concept of scientific progress being the only religion of the present. You will find that Huxley suggests in this novel that scientific advance has taken over the human individual completely. The human being has been marginalized, and society, or the power of society, has taken over because it is controlled by science. Huxley's suggestion is that intellectuals and thinkers should correct this imbalance. They should not allow science to be totally imbalanced. And progress which marginalizes the individual and which gives central importance to the state is not progress at all. Huxley was not only a novelist, but he was also an essayist. He was a poet. He was a travel writer. And he was a mystic who was experimenting with the human mind and consciousness. So as you can see, there are a great variety of genres in which he was writing. Before we talk about the novel Brave New World, before we discuss the concepts like utopia or dystopia, which is there in this novel, let us first talk a little about Huxley's life. Huxley was born in 1894 in England, just the turn of the century. Victorian England was changing into the modern England. Not only this, historically it was an important time, but not only this, even his family history was very significant. Huxley comes both on the father's and mother's side from very reputed thinkers and intellectuals. For instance, we have his father, Leonard Huxley, who was a well-known literary figure of his time. His grandfather, T.H. Huxley, was a great biologist, closely associated with Darwin's evolution. I'm sure you've heard of Darwin's evolution, survival of the fittest, and so on. His elder brother, Julian, was also a biologist. And on his mother's side, we have the famous literary figure, the ruler of Victorian England in letters, that is Matthew Arnold. I'm sure all of you have heard of Matthew Arnold, a great poet, a great critic, a great thinker of the Victorian times. So now we shall talk about Aldous Huxley as a thinker and a writer. How did he develop? This is important. Because of all these influences, his family's influences on him, he could write from anthropology to zoology. He could write from poetry to mysticism. His interests were very varied, as we can see. He wanted to do medicine. Because he had a scientific background, he wanted to do medicine. Unfortunately, after he finished his college at Eton, he had a problem with his eye, and the eyes lost their sight. It was a terrible tragedy for him. And he started learning Braille. Braille is that with which the people who cannot see read. Fortunately for him, after a couple of years, he regained partial sight. And with his partial sight, by using a magnifying glass, he could see. But he never felt disappointed or depressed. He felt that loss of eyesight for him was a single most important experience, because when we don't have physical sight, we have something called as insight. The ability to look into things, to look deeply and understand. We have the famous example of Helen Keller. I'm sure you have heard, in a story called 3 Days to See. She says that people who have eyes don't see much. So maybe Huxley, because of his partial sight, is able to look into things much better than us. He's able to look into the problems of science which you and I don't look at, because we look at the advantages which science gives us. An air condition in the room makes us feel comfortable. The lights make us study well. We can travel by cars. Ford is a very important concept in this novel. I'll tell you about it later. The Ford, the automobile. This idea is here in Huxley's experience of his loss of eyesight. Of course, this handicap did not make him into a person who was socially maladjusted. Huxley continued to live a full life. He lived at a time when science was making unprecedented progress. In the 20th century, scientific progress was unimaginable. It had never happened in the 19th or 18th or 17th centuries. Therefore, Huxley was concentrating on this concept that what appears to be real progress, is it really progress, or is it some kind of threat to humanity? Now let us talk about the background of this novel. The novel, as I told you repeatedly, is called Brave New World, because Huxley is describing a futuristic world, a world of the future. And this future is about 5 centuries away. 2540 AD, that is the year he mentions. But the calendar has changed. He says that this is 632 AF. AF, just like we say AD today. He says AF. The reason he says it because this translates to after Ford. AF, after Ford. Ford is considered to be the deity of this new world. He's like God. Christ, Christianity, the cross, these are all not allowed in this world. So we require a new deity, and that new deity is Ford. Ford, who is the founder of this new world. Therefore, 632 after Ford, he says that this society is based on a motto, and this motto is community identity, stability. These are the three important terms. So the concept in the novel is an utopian concept. I will explain to you utopia slightly later, after we have finished talking about the novel. The utopian vision which he shows is of a world state, capital W, capital S. He makes it into a new world. You can imagine what the world state means. It's a globalized concept. Today we call it as a global village. I'm sure you keep coming across this term, global village. So Huxley is calling, in 1932 such a concept didn't exist, but visualizing a future global world, he calls this as a world state, which is founded by Ford and which is now ruled by 10 world controllers, not president or prime minister, not a king or monarch, but the term is used again with capital W and capital C, world controllers. Look at how he uses the terms. Huxley is using powerful satire in this novel, great irony, and a very pessimistic vision. Because you remember this phase, the 30s was a phase of skepticism, a phase where he did not have faith in anything. So he's questioning this entire concept of political power, economic, social stability, etc. For instance, there was the theory of Marxism. Marxism was an ideal at this time. He uses one of the characters and calls him Bernard Marx. When we talk about the text, I will tell you more about this. This is ironic, using the word Marx. Then Ford, I already mentioned, ironic reference. Then you have the concept of the world controller. The world controller is a dictator, and the ideal of the 30s was democracy, not dictatorship. Dictatorship was not considered to be good. So why is he using dictatorship? Because it is a satire. The satirical expression is very important. Then he also refers, why he was doing this is because his background. There was Nazism in Germany, there was Mussolini in Italy, then there was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. These were all threats to the individual freedom. Remember, I told you that Huxley was questioning the concept of giving over the power to science or the state. Therefore, this idea is very significant, that the world around was passing through lots of political upheavals, social upheavals, economic upheavals. Huxley was trying to tell us that uncontrolled progress in any dimension, whether it is political free thinking or whether it is economic freedom, all these are dangerous. Everything has to be within control. The entire novel focuses on this. So it begins with a positive vision where science has ruled out dirt, disease, old age, unhappiness. These are our problems today. Problem is old age. We don't want to become old. There is disease all around. Anybody can die, even a youngster. We become unhealthy. We lose our physical balance. The concept of utopia comes from a term which Thomas More, the famous Renaissance humanist, had coined. This was the name of a book he wrote about an ideal commonwealth. The etymology of this word is based on two Greek words. Utopia, meaning an ideal place, and utopia meaning a non-existent place. So combine these two, an ideal but non-existent. It is ideal, perfect, but it is also imaginary. This is the concept of utopia. Many people have written utopian novels like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne's, you must have heard of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and so on. But in the 20th century, utopian vision became mainly dystopian. Dystopian means a negative utopia, a utopia which has gone wrong, apparently ideal, but with lots of dangers underlying it. George Orwell's famous novel 1984 is a very good example of a dystopian novel. In Brave New World, the dystopia is constructed around science and society. These are the two important constructs. One is that science has made the human being into a machine, which is wonderful because today we are talking in terms of emotional intelligence. So we don't want human beings to have excessive emotion. We also have problems like population. So if you have a test tube baby, no population problem. Nobody can get married. Nobody can, have a life of their own because these things are forbidden by the state. All the people are produced on demand. Today we say market-driven economy, demand and supply. These are all satirized in the novel. So if there is a demand for 100 workers in the factory, 100 epsilons will be produced because they have a rigid caste system. The highest caste is called alpha plus. The next caste is beta. Then you have gamma. Then you have delta. And finally, now let us come to talking about the title of the novel and a little more about the novel's history. Can you tell me what the title is?
Brave New World.
That's very good. This title, Brave New World, is borrowed from Shakespeare's Tempest. One of the last plays of Shakespeare is The Tempest, a very mature play, where you have the female protagonist Miranda. Miranda has been brought up on an island by her father Prospero, and she hasn't seen human beings. She's seen only Ariel and Caliban, both of whom are not human. Now, because Prospero's enemies were sailing around that island, Prospero creates a storm and brings them here. For the first time, Miranda sees these villains, but she doesn't know they are villains. She says, "Oh, what a brave new world which has such beauteous beings." She's calling them beauteous, beautiful, excellent, good. But actually they are evil because they wanted to kill Prospero and Miranda. She doesn't know it. So Shakespeare himself uses Miranda's feeling of the brave new world or her feeling of excitement in a very ironic sense because her uncle is not a very nice person, doesn't describe the world in which these people live, doesn't deserve this kind of a description. So this description is not a very relevant description even to Miranda's world as it is to this world. But the first part of the novel gives you a completely utopian picture. It is not at all dystopian in the first 2-3 chapters because Huxley wants you to experience what is called as real paradise. But then remember that there is always a serpent in paradise. Paradise is never complete without the serpent. So that will come later. Now, what Huxley is talking about here is that the world of the future is a world of immense possibilities. he contrasts this world with a savage reservation. Again with capital S and capital R, he writes, savage reservation which is in New Mexico. These are all geographic locales which you can find. The world state is functioning in London, England, because he was an English author. But much of his life he lived in America also. So now the savage reservation, moves to New Mexico, where people who don't fit into the utopia, they are misfits. They are called as savage. Savage means uncivilized. They are put there. It is like a place for exile. Anybody who commits a crime in utopia will be thrown into savage exile. People who are misfits in utopia, who cannot be trained at all, they are thrown into the savage exile. So the two worlds are contrasted. The contrast increases the utopian dystopian description of the novel. What is apparently utopian is actually dystopian, and what is apparently a negative picture is actually a positive picture, because in the central concern is the individual. Huxley is constantly referring to the individual. Now we have come to the last part of this lesson, where we shall talk about the plot of this novel. I'll tell you in brief what is going to take place in the novel, which has 18 chapters. The novel begins with a scene in the London Hatcheries and Conditioning Centre. This is called as the Central Hatcheries and Conditioning Centre. This is where all the population of the New World is decanted. Now you can't use a term like born, because born is a very vulgar word. They are all decanted out of a test tube. And some new students have come whom the world controller is taking around and showing. It's an introductory chapter. Showing the students is like showing the reader a new world. This leads to the conditioning center, tells us about education. Because in society, education is very important. The future citizens of the world are prepared in our universities, so education. Then comes conditioning, and here we also meet the world controller Mustafa Mond. His name is Mustafa Mond. He comes and gives a lecture. In his lecture, he clearly explains what is this new world, because Mond knows the old and the new both, and he wants to specify why the new world is better. We are also introduced to two of the workers in the hatcheries. One is called as Henry Foster and the other Lenina Crow. Henry and Lenina are dating each other. But Lenina's friend Fanny, who's also Fanny Crow, because they are distantly related, from the test tube, says that it is not correct to date a single person. So Lenina chooses a person called Bernard Marx. Bernard Marx. Bernard Marx is a rebel, but he's also an Alpha Plus who has the permit to go to the reservation. So Lenina and Bernard go to the reservation, but Lenina cannot bear it. It's a terrible world. She's used to this world where everything is joy and happiness. She comes back, but Bernard wants to take revenge against the director of the hatcheries, who keeps threatening to send him to exile by bringing his son and wife from the reservation. Words like son and wife are not used in the New World, but the director of the hatcheries, when he was young, had taken a girl like Bernard is taking Lenina, and because she conceived, he left her there. And now John and Linda, these are the names of these two people, they have been in the reservation for 25 years. John is born in the reservation, so he is described as the savage. Throughout the novel, he's not called John as much as savage. Bernard thinks by bringing the savage to the New World, he can confront the director and punish him because he's all the time threatening him. John's coming here overlaps the two worlds, the old and the new, and we get to see a vision of what exactly Huxley is trying to tell us. Of course, Linda dies here of an overdose of a drug called soma. We will discuss this also when we are talking about the novel in great detail. And in his grief, the people of the New World have no emotions, but John has grief. So in his grief, he starts creating a riot. He's arrested, and Bernard and his friend, who's called Helmholtz Watson, they both of them who have been encouraging John are sent on an exile. They said, you don't deserve to stay here. John tries to escape from Mustafa Mond because he wants to experiment on him. And by escaping, he gives in to the temptation of soma and free sex. When he does this, he cannot face himself. He feels terribly guilty. And out of this guilt, he kills himself. So the novel ends in a tragedy. This is all we have in the first lesson. 3 more lessons we shall have. Now I would like you to ask some questions on whatever I have told you today. Would you like to begin?
Our present world have one founder who is God, actually. So in this novel, A Brave New World, what's the concept of deity of Ford?
In the novel, nowhere does Huxley give any clear idea about what he means by Ford. He does not explain that Ford is instead of God, but he gives many clues from which we can understand. You know, Christianity is abolished. So they cannot have a God, they cannot have religion. And in one of the chapters, I'll explain to you how a religious rite is carried out. You know, the religious rite is only a terrible farce. As far as Huxley is concerned, religion was mysticism. So he's using the term Ford in a very powerful, ironic way, because Ford was the, mechanical genius. Ford was the inventor of the automobile. Therefore, using Ford in a mechanical world, it's almost as though all the people in this world are like machines, and Ford is their God. Ford is described in the novel as the person who founded civilization. Before Ford, there was no civilization. After Ford only, there has been civilization. Like we say, before God, there was no creation. There was only chaos. So after Ford, there is civilization. This is the only description which Huxley gives, but he doesn't make it very clear. Would you like to ask?
Ma'am, you told us about the 10 world controllers, and I wanted to ask, did all of them have a negative effect on the people, and who were they exactly?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me first start by telling you that one of the world controllers I mentioned, he's the world controller of Europe, and his name is Mustafa Mond. The remaining 9 world controllers are not mentioned by name. It's only as though there are 10 of them, and all of them are depicted as benevolent dictators. They are autocrats, but they are very friendly and very paternalistic. They are not, overtly rude. Unlike the director of the hatcheries, who's a very rude and, very authoritarian person, always exercising his authority negatively, Mustafa Mond is always smiling. He's always, even when he exiles Bernard, he does it with a smile. He uses authority, but he uses it, it is like the velvet glove. The iron hand is inside, but all you can see is the very soft velvet glove. This is his concept. And Mustafa Mond is the only person in the novel who knows both the worlds, the past and the present. He has read Shakespeare, he has read the Bible, but he says that I have chosen the new world and I have not chosen the old. So he is a representative of Huxley's argument that human beings are choosing science, although they are losing their individuality. They are choosing stability and they are giving up their individuality. They are giving up their human concept. Would you like to ask?
About the savage reservations, Is it a satirical representation of racism of Huxley's times, or is it a completely imaginary thing?
Yes, the savage reservation has many symbolic meanings. One of the symbols which the savage reservation uses is the discrimination. We can call it racial discrimination because most of the process of colonization was, the white races colonizing the colored races. Therefore, we can say that it is a concept of racism. But the savages are described as uncivilized, not much of their color is mentioned. As far as, the distinct of color as racism is not mentioned. But certainly they are a different race because they cannot fit into utopia, and Lenina and John are always misfits. Lenina says that I wanted to teach them sanitation, they didn't want to learn sanitation. You remember that in race, this is one of the important things. Even in the Commonwealth Games, we had this problem with Kalmadi saying that our hygiene is different from their hygiene. Don't you have? These are very specific things. But the way in which the reservation is kept in New Mexico, the geographic locale itself is important. And then the contrast of these two worlds. But of course, I can't explain all these things to all the three of you who have asked wonderful questions. These will become clear when we talk about the novel in great detail, which we will do in the next lesson. Thank you.